morning, everyone. My name's Amy, and I'll be your teacher today for our reading class, our critical reading. Today, we're going to be talking about the social issue of poverty and the social issue of women in poverty. So let's get started. We have 6 different goals for today's class. First, we're going to understand how social issue plays an important role in reading, especially critical readings. And then I'm going to teach you and guide you through several strategies that you can apply when you are conducting a course of critical reading. I'm going to help you to identify the main idea of the text, especially in a longer text. And then we're going to help you to understand how these supporting details revolves around a main idea and how these supporting details would help us identify the meaning that the author is trying to express. And next, we're going to teach you that in a longer text, how can you use the context, so the sentence before and after, to identify an unfamiliar vocabulary without having to go through a dictionary or Google Translate. And at last, we're going to synthesize and combine all these information together to now help you expand your knowledge base and help you in the future to read more critically and more effectively. So let's get started. Our first goal today is to help you understand how social issue plays an important role in our reading, especially for today's topic, poverty. So when we talk about poverty, the first thing we're going to be looking at is what exactly is poverty? What do you associate when you think of the word poverty? Are you experiencing it yourself? And more importantly, if you're not, then whose battle is it? Who is experiencing poverty? So take about 15 seconds, really think to yourself or jot it down on a piece of paper of what your definition of poverty is, as well as who is currently fighting this battle. Let's go. Now, for me, poverty, if I were to define it, I'm going to quote from the UN in 2018, is that 1 in 10 people around the world were using less than $1.9 a day. Think about how much money you actually spend a day just on food. And think about how little $1.9 is. And that's what we call the poverty line. So for me, poverty, or for the UN, poverty means $1.9. Think about that. Apply to what you just jotted down on your piece of paper. And so who is currently battling this? I'm going to guess you're a student in Taiwan, aren't you? And so as a student in Taiwan, which region or which percentage of people have you witnessed yourself or on the news or on social media that are actually living in poverty right now? Luckily, as a Taiwanese, we are actually one of the countries that's living above the poverty line. We actually have the lowest percentage of people living under poverty line in Asia. So consider ourselves lucky. So why are we discussing the definition of these 2 words and understanding the social issue? Is that by expanding our general knowledge on these topics, it helps us better associate with the topic that we're going to discuss later and the reading that we're going to view later. And now we have discussed a little bit ahead of our topic already. We're now going into how to predict the content of your reading based on anticipation strategy. So, seeing from the word anticipation, you get it, is that you're going to guess what possibly could come from your reading. To help you with that, I've given you 4 different tasks. You're going to look at these questions, provoke your own thoughts, and try to think what could possibly appear in the reading later. The first one is, when it comes to poverty, what kind of things would you associate with? Mind you, I'm not going to give you any hints. I'm not talking about nouns, adjectives, verbs. I want you to really think, really dig in. Think of all the possibilities. And next, I want you to think, for a student your age, what does living in poverty mean to you? Is it actions that you can do? Is it things that you must do? What is it? Now, the third thing is, I want you to think, if you look around your surroundings, where in Taiwan do you see poverty? And what other places of the world do you see poverty existing? And the last thing I want you to think about is how do people get out of poverty? Is it to get a better job? Is it to raise their minimum wage? Is it to receive better education? What kind of things can they do to get themselves out of poverty? So take about maybe 15 seconds or to a minute, jot it down on a piece of paper, and then we're going to come back and continue with our anticipation strategy. Now that you have finished brainstorming on these 4 different topics, we're now going to go into our reading. We're going to give you several minutes to go through the reading, and then we're going to come back together and start to work on our reading strategy. Let's go. Poverty, 1867 to 1945. When the Dominion of Canada was created in 1867, governments did not assume the direct responsibilities for the poor. Before 1867, only the maritime colonies had adopted English poor laws. There were no workhouses in which the poor were given accommodation and food in return for work. Responsibility for the poor usually fell to churches and charities, and very poor people often ended up in houses of refuge, mental institutions, or prisons. Official and elite attitudes towards the poor were often negative or condescending. It was assumed that poverty resulted from a moral failing on the part of the poor. Idealistic visions contributed to such attitudes. Canada was a place with abundant land and resources where anybody willing to work was bound to prosper. This utopian vision of Canada ignored the reality that farms were very difficult to establish, that resources were highly seasonal, and that winter was a time of shortage and hardship for a large number of people. In the last half of the 19th century, urbanization and early industrialization increased the number of urban poor. A new type of poverty appeared, poverty that resulted from unemployment, not merely seasonal job shortages, but the shortage of wage-paid jobs due to economic cycles, the closing of businesses, short-term layoffs, and trade depressions. Historians have shown that in major Canadian cities in 1901, 1 of every 7 families could not survive on the pooled wage earnings of family members. If the poor survived at all, they did so by participating in an informal economy. Scrounging, bartering, growing vegetables, or keeping animals, or taking in lodgers, if they had space. Many did not survive. Montreal, for instance, was one of the most dangerous cities in the Western world for newborn babies. At the end of the 1890s, 26% of babies died before they reached their first birthday of illnesses associated with poverty and malnutrition. Studies of average wages in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver show that there was modest growth in real wages, which means wages after adjusting for price inflation in the early 1900s. During World War I, rapid inflation halted the rise in real wages, and gains did not appear again until the 1920s. Then the Depression of the 1930s caused an increase in poverty due to unemployment. It has been estimated that in the winter of 1933, at the depth of the Depression, over 32% of all wage-paid workers were unemployed. In these circumstances, government began, although very slowly and at first without success, to develop policies that would help to alleviate the problem of poverty. The first universal social welfare program in Canada was the Family Allowance Program, introduced by the federal government in 1944. The Small Unemployment Insurance Program, introduced during World War II, was expanded after the war. These were the foundation of Canada's social security system or welfare state. The problem of poverty was not solved, however, and relative poverty, meaning wide gaps between low-income earners and others, persisted. Nevertheless, the social security system succeeded in reducing the impact of poverty for many families. So, you've just finished the reading. Isn't it quite surprising? When you think of the word Canada, you associate it with wealth, stability, social values, these are very positive vocabularies. However, what you just read actually conflicts with our general assumption. So what we have done beforehand with the anticipation and the expansion of this topic would actually correlate with how you're going to view this reading, which is something you've just experienced. By reading this conflicting article, it does provoke some interesting insight, isn't it? So why are we talking about Canada? By understanding the possible discussion around this topic, it would actually help us to better read and better critique a reading. So having seen the first paragraph, now this is what I want you to do. I want you to think back and look at these 4 different titles. Which one of this title do you think best fit the descriptions and the contents that are outlined in the first paragraph? Did the first paragraph tell you about the poor laws before 1945? Did it discuss the solution to global poverty? Was it talking about the different understanding of poverty before 1945, or was it discussing the gaps between the rich and the poor? Look back and come back to me. Good luck. So the first technique that we're going to teach you on how to better find a title that is suited to the information that was given in the introductory paragraph, so the first paragraph, will be that we're going to be looking at the details surrounding the main idea. By looking at this detail, we will be able to find which of the titles best fits the introductory paragraph. So going back to the first paragraph, I've highlighted some important information for you. The first one is that the government did not assume direct responsibility for the poor. And then the repetition of the keyword responsibility is mentioned again in the 5th line, saying that these responsibility fell to churches and charities. So the repetition of 2 keywords, responsibility. Then it further illustrated the attitude of officials and elites. And then it talked about the utopian vision and the reality behind that. All these are actually different perspectives of how people view poverty. And so the answer should be quite simple. The best title suited for the introductory paragraph should be option 3, different understanding of poverty before 1945. And as you can see, from the smaller supporting details, we were able to draw out a small conclusion on which title is best suited to summarize the paragraph. Now we're going to look into the second paragraph. What are we seeing? In the second paragraph, I'm going to introduce to you the techniques on how to infer the meaning of unfamiliar vocabulary. Furthermore, I'm going to teach you, based on just the sentence structure and the grammatical structure alone, how can you infer meaning without having to go to a dictionary or Google Translate. Isn't that exciting? And so we're going to be looking in the midsection of paragraph 2. There's an interesting parallel grammatical structure. If the poor survived at all, they did so by, and they give several examples. If they had space. This repetition of particular grammatical structure, what does it tell us? When we think about the word if, it means it hasn't happened. They are pretending it happened. And so the grammatical structure we're looking at is called past real conditional. Essentially, we're referring the real intention of the author from the sentence structure that we're seeing on the screen right now. So let's look at how this text actually infers the real intention of the author. By using the word if, they give others several examples or several actions they could take. However, in the same paragraph, they also talked about people would not survive. And so this if does not exist. It will take place. And so we're now able to predict the attitude of the author based on this if. Even though he said the word if, it will happen. This is a definition. This is definitely going to happen. It's not a conditional. Basically, this past real conditional sentence paints a doomsday picture for their survival. And so, based on this simple grammatical structure alone, we are able to identify the attitude of the author without having to second guess his opinions. Now we're going to move on to the third paragraph. We're going to be looking at the concluding sentence of this particular paragraph to help us anticipate what's going to come next. In our previous slide, we talked about how to look at the introductory paragraph to be able to identify the summary of a key message. Now, the function of a concluding sentence basically is a wrap-up of previous statements and an introduction of the next statement. So first, I'm going to help you review what are the functions of concluding paragraph. First, it helps us to restate the main idea of the paragraph you just read. Second, it helps us summarize the main key details of the paragraph. And at last, it foreshadows the content of the next paragraph that is following this one. And so, by looking at this particular concluding sentence, it says government began, although very slowly at first without success, to develop policies that would help to alleviate the problem of poverty. So what kind of keywords do you see in this? The word policy, isn't it? So when we see this word policy, it helps us to foreshadow that in later paragraphs, we're going to start reading about different policies that are being introduced. And you may begin to anticipate or guess what measures will be taking place in order to fight the social issue of poverty in Canada. And so using the technique we just learned by looking at the introductory sentences and concluding sentence, we're now going to try to combine them together. We're going to use these two sentences to infer meaning without having to read the entire paragraph again. Now remember, a lot of times you're going to be reading a large chunk of text, but perhaps you don't have time. Quickly scanning through the first sentence and the last sentence of the paragraph would help you quickly determine whether this information is useful to you. And so, by looking at the introductory sentence and the concluding sentence of this paragraph, first, the first universal social welfare program. That's the introductory sentence. Nevertheless, the social security system succeeded. We're able to infer from just these two sentences that one, something was established, and two, it was successful. But we need to look at the transitional signal, nevertheless. So we know that there's a bit of twists and turns in there. By combining these two sentences effectively, we're able to not have to read the entire paragraph, but grasp the gist of this reading. Now, we're going to move on to the next technique. We're going to be finding the focus of the reading. So there's still 4 different options on the screen right now. Take a few seconds, look through them, and tell me, based on your understanding of the reading, which one of these options most suited for the main message of this reading. Now, I'm going to tell you about a small trap that you may be experiencing. A lot of people oftentimes will read a reading and use its concluding paragraph as the main message. It is effective sometimes. However, sometimes it would not be comprehensible. It may not be able to convey the attitude of the authors effectively. So you need to think back of the overall impression you've gotten from the reading to make an effective judgment. Let's go. Now, in order to successfully identify the main focus, we're now going to look into how to identify the main idea of a text. You may realize that it was a rather long text. Are there any techniques? Of course. We're now going to 3 different steps on how you can identify the main idea of a text. The first one is that you need to develop an overview of article by recalling the information you've just seen. Have a general, vague idea of what you just read and the main message the author is trying to convey. And then you're going to take a review of specific paragraphs by going back and double-checking what you just read to make sure that it actually matches what you've understood as the overall meaning. And then you are going to try to recreate the author's view faithfully by understanding their stance, perspective, or angle. Through these 3 steps, we're able to find the cause, the further development, and the result of the entire reading. With that, we can see that the first option, which is poverty has been linked to seasonal, regional, and catastrophic unemployment problem in the pre-World War II era, yet the state response was not timely. this statement will be best fitted to summarize the entire article. Did you get the right answer? Now we're going to move on to the next technique, which is to help you to identify unfamiliar vocabulary based on the context alone. So the first key thing that I want to share with you is that never, ever look up the meaning of a word when you're reading, because it actually interrupts your flow of reading, which means that the idea juices that you're having will get interrupted as well. And when you're stumbling across unfamiliar words when you're reading, it's actually a great opportunity for you to practice a natural understanding of these words. And in the future, when you see these words appear in different settings, you are actually able to better grasp its linguistic meanings. And now we're going to look at how can we effectively identify the meaning of unfamiliar text based on our reading. The first one we're going to be looking at is this sentence. Before 1867, only the maritime colonies adopted English poor laws. There were no workhouses. You may think, ooh, work and house. Although it's a compound word, we put it together. It's a place that you can stay and work. Makes a lot of sense. However, despite the fact this is a simple compound word, you're not getting the very explicit meaning, the precise meaning this word is trying to express. So based on the context alone, we know that this is a place where they give accommodation, they give food in return for work. And so the dictionary definition is that a workhouse is a public shelter, so the government is actually paying for it, where the people can stay for food and accommodation in return using their physical labor. So that's the explicit definition. In this context, we did not need to know the explicit explanation, but we are able to grasp the gist of this vocabulary based on the context and the explanation alone. The second word is a little bit more difficult. It's the word condescending. Now, when we're looking at the word condescending, we're going to try to identify it based on a grammatical structure. So what do you see before condescending? It's another conjunction, or. When you have the conjunction, or, usually it will be a noun plus a noun, an adjective plus an adjective, or a verb plus a verb. It's usually paralleled. So looking at the adjective before the conjunction, or we see the word negative. So usually it's talking about the same or similar cluster of meaning. Looking at these four different options, we can now first cross off the positive meaning words. So that will be option B, showing respect, because that is more of a positive word. And also the A option, feeling sympathetic, doesn't seem to fit into the context. Option D, intimidating, does not fit into the meaning of the segment as well. And so probably the most suitable option will be option C, showing disdain or lack of respect. Next, we're going to look at the even more difficult word, which prosper. So the word prosper is talking about where anybody willing to work was bound to prosper. Okay, so that's an action. If they take this action, they will become this. Based on the context, we understood that to become prosper is to perform a particular action. Now, besides performing a particular action, it's something that they will become. And so among these four different options, the first one we're going to be looking at further detail to support what kind of actions on what they need to do and what they need to become to be prosper. So number one is that Canada was a place with abundant land and resources. When you are at this place and you do the hard work, you will prosper. And then with the second prospered, we can see that this utopian vision, which means that that is something, an action they have taken, then they will become that. And so based on the four different options, it wouldn't be option B, to earn very little money, because that doesn't sound like a result you're going to get after you put in the hard work. And then to work harder is an action, but not necessarily a result, a good result in that. And then to gain abundant land and resources, that's simply a repetition of the previous text. so not necessarily fitting into this context. And so based on that, we would know the answer will be option A to become successful. An action you would take, and then a result you will get. Now we're going to move on to the word halted. The word halted appears as a verb. And how do we infer the meaning of the word halted based on the text? We see that it's combined with the word rise, which means to increase, to go up. But something happened. Something did something to the rise. And so, based on the further supporting details that gains did not appear again, so something positive did not appear again until later. So based on the 4 different options that are given, it wouldn't be the word stabilize, because it means something that exists and continues to exist without changing. It wouldn't necessarily mean speed up either, because that would be more of a positive thing. But halted and did not appear again is more of a negative thing. Then we have option B or C to stop or slow down. Based on the context that it did not appear again, we're going to assume it most likely means is to stop. So halted in this case, when we talk about it being stopping the rise and that everything was put on hold and nothing better appear again until later, it fits the context better. Now the last word we're going to talk about is alleviate. Rather difficult word. When we talk about the word alleviate, we're going to be looking at first the definition in the dictionary, which is to reduce a problem or make a problem less severe. With this particular word, we're going to discuss several techniques that can help you better understand this word using the prefix, the suffix, and the root word. So what the word alleviate is made up of 3 different components. The first is to al, which is to do something, the to, from A to B. So there's a process. That's the prefix. And then we have the root word levy, which means to lift something light that is enabling it to float. That's the root word. And at the very end, we have the ate, which is the state of the verb, the suffix. So we're able to understand the condition that this particular vocabulary is in. It is a verb. By understanding the root word, the suffix, and the prefix, we're able to understand more of other vocabulary. For example, the word levitation has the word levy in it, which means to float. So we understood that the word levitation would probably mean you're enabling something to float, a mechanism of some sort. And then we have the word elevator, which is a mechanism that allows you to go up. So by learning about these different structures and its linguistic features, we're able to understand more vocabularies, which means we build a bigger word bank. Now that we're finished with the first reading, we're going to move on to our second reading, using the different techniques that we've just learned to make sure you actually integrated them into your reading skills. Spend a couple minutes, read through the second reading, and we're going to come back and see whether or not you have actually acquired these skills. Good luck! Women and poverty. Women constitute a majority of the poor and often the poorest of the poor. The societal disadvantage and inequality they face because they are women shapes their experience of poverty differently from that of men, increases their vulnerability, and makes it more challenging for them to climb out of poverty. In other words, poverty is a gendered experience. Addressing it requires a gendered analysis of norms and values, the division of assets, work and responsibility, and the dynamics of power and control between women and men in poor households. In most societies, gender norms define women's role as largely relegated to the home as mothers and caretakers, and men's role as responsible for productive activities outside the home. These norms influence institutional policies and laws that define women and men's access to productive resources such as education, employment, land, and credit. There's overwhelming evidence from around the world to show that girls and women are more disadvantaged than boys and men in their access to these valuable productive resources. There is also ample evidence to show that the responsibilities of women and the challenges they face within poor households and communities are different from those of men. Persistent gender inequalities and differences in women's and men's role greatly influences the causes, experiences, and consequences of women's poverty. Policies and programs to alleviate poverty must, therefore, take account of gender inequality and gender differences to effectively address the needs and constraints of both poor women and men. Women's experience of poverty. Girls and women in poor households bear a disproportionate share of the work and responsibility of feeding and caring for family members through unpaid housework. In poor rural households, for example, women's work is dominated by activities such as firewood, water and fodder collection, care of livestock, and subsistence agriculture. The drudgery of women's work and its time-intensive demands contributes to women's time poverty and greatly limit poor women's choices of other, more productive income-earning opportunities. Faced with difficult time allocation choices, women in poor households will often sacrifice their own health and nutrition or the education of their daughters by recruiting them to take care of siblings or share in other household tasks. This is just one piece of a pattern of gendered discrimination in the allocation of resources in poor households. Evidence shows that the gender gap in nutrition, education, and health are greater in poor households. This lack of investment in the human capital of girls perpetuates a vicious intergenerational cycle of poverty and disadvantage that is partly responsible for the intraceable nature of poverty. A focus on poor women as distinct from men in efforts to reduce poverty is justified because women's paid and unpaid work is crucial for the survival of poor households. Women are economic actors. They produce and process food for the family. They are the primary caretaker of children, the elderly, and the sick, and their income and labor are directed toward children's education, health, and well-being. In fact, there is incontrovertible evidence from a number of studies conducted during the 1980s that mothers typically spend their income on food and health care for children, which is in sharp contrast to men who spend a higher proportion of their income for personal needs. A study conducted in Brazil, for example, found that the positive effect on the probability that a child will survive in urban Brazil is almost 20 times greater when the household income is controlled by a woman rather than by the man. Yet women faces significant constraints in maximizing their productivity. They often do not have equal access to productive inputs to markets for their goods. They own only 15% of the land worldwide, work longer hours than men, and earn lower wages. They are overrepresented among workers in the informal labor markets in jobs that are seasonal, more precarious, and not protected by labor standards. Despite this, policies and programs that are based on notion of a typical household as consisting of a male breadwinner and dependent women and children often target men for the provision of productive resources and services. Such an approach widens the gender-based productivity gap, negatively affects women's economic status, and does little to reduce poverty. Addressing these gender biases and inequalities by intentionally investing in women as economic agents and doing so within a framework of rights that ensures that women's access to and control over productive resources as a part of their entitlement as citizens is an effective and efficient poverty reduction strategy. So how is the reading? We're going to first look at the title and the subheading, something that did not appear in the first reading. There are now several options appearing on the screen. What you're going to do is that you're going to look at the different subheadings and title that was given in the reading and choose which one of these topics were actually discussed in the reading, Or that is to say, based on the title and the subheading alone, can you use your anticipation strategy to guess what kind of topics that were included? And so the title was Woman and Poverty. The subheadings were Woman's Experience on Poverty and Why Focus Women in Poverty. So spend several seconds, jot it down on a piece of paper, which one of those options mentioned above would actually something that you would guess would appear in the reading. Good luck. Now if we come back, we can see that there are 4 different options that would fit the anticipation that we're guessing of the topics that could be discussed in this reading. Number 1 is that how gender is related to poverty. We can see that from the title, Woman and Poverty. And then they also talked about the reason why woman is in poverty. So that is something that was discussed. And then what happens when woman is in poverty? What kind of consequences are there? And the last, examples of women in poverty. It did not talk about how women fight against poverty or ways to empower women. These are not the things that we can infer based on the title and the subheading alone. In the previous reading, we looked at introductory sentences. Now we're going to be looking at the thesis statement. A thesis statement is essentially the key message of the entire reading. And by understanding the key message alone, we are able to understand the overall structure of the reading more effectively. So the thesis statement of this reading is that, in other words, poverty is a gender experiences. Addressing it requires a gender analysis of norms and value, the division of assets, work and responsibilities, and the dynamic of power and control between women and men in poor households. Simply by looking at this thesis statement alone, we can see the different subtopics that are going to be discussed in the readings. And so the thesis statement is a powerful tool to help you identify the main message of a reading, especially in a longer text. Now we're going to look at the different definitions of unfamiliar vocabulary. The first one is the word norm. Now this one, I think, is quite simple because it's basically a part of a word we're more familiar with, which is normal, which means something that you see every day, something that is common. And now we're going to look at different sentence structures. We're going to be looking at this particular one because it's interesting. It helps to demonstrate the attitude of the author. The first one is, there is overwhelming evidence. The author is quite passionate about this topic, isn't it? And then he or she have put forth many different supporting details to show that. In later paragraph, we see again, there is also ample evidence to show. He repeated the same meaning of sentence one more time and repetition of the key word evidence to place further emphasis on factual and valid arguments. This kind of parallelism to display evidence help us to understand, number 1, the attitude of the author, and number 2, that he has put in a lot of work to ensure that his arguments are valid by providing many evidence, many supporting details. And later, we can see in the reading that some are quoted. So quotation mark usually acts in 2 ways. Number 1 was citing outside sources, using other people's information as part of our own argument to validate our arguments. Number 2, quotation is also used to emphasize a particular point. In this case, the author put a quotation around the word time poverty, and later explaining what time poverty is and how it can affect women and the consequences of them being in poverty. And so with these quotation marks, the author further emphasized what this is, to define it, and to explain its importance that is attached to women in poverty and why woman does not have time. Now, based on the subheading, Woman's Experience of Poverty, and the last concluding sentence of this paragraph, we can see that the word time poverty is further emphasized. More explanation is put on it. So the author defines time poverty as an experience which is a lack of investment in the human capital of girls perpetuates a vicious intergeneration cycle of poverty and disadvantage that is partly responsible for the untraceable nature of poverty. This further emphasis on what time poverty is draws a conclusion to illustrate the vicious cycle of women in poverty, which means that we can see even further of how the author wants us to focus on this particular point. In this particular paragraph, we see a rhetorical question. It's rather short compared to other segments. It's a way for us to see as a short introduction and connector to the next sentence. This particular short paragraph allows us to raise a rhetorical question, essentially drawing a small conclusion from the previous statement and act as a connector to the next statement or the next argument. And so, based on this particular definition alone, because we see a colon right after women are economic actors, we know that the author is going to begin, illustrate, and demonstrate what does that mean. What does it mean for women to be economic actors? Furthermore, based on his explanation and his statements, he actually cited an outside source. This in-text citation simply further provides evidence to demonstrate the validity of his argument. And this in-text citation simply furthers his arguments and demonstrated the validity of his arguments and statements. And with this particular paragraph, what I want to point out is the use of key pronouns. We can see that in this one single paragraph alone, the word they is used 3 times. They often do not. They own only 15%. They are overrepresented. All these, by the using of repeating key pronouns, creates a sense of urgency that the author is trying to promote and place further stress on the concept of woman being poverty. And then now we can see a 2 polar figures that are also mentioned in this paragraph. The first one is that the woman only owns about 15% of the land, while the other one is that women are overrepresented among informal labor market, which is a dangerous market. One being too little, the other being too much. This very contrastive figure creates a sense of contradiction to alert the reader that urgency is here. And so this type of sentence structure actually highlights the woman's situation even further. And so when you're reading, ensure that you pay attention to these particular figures or these particular statements. And then last, we're going to be looking at this particular sentence in the concluding paragraph. Addressing these gender biases and inequalities by intentionally investing women as economic agents. This particular set is a part of the conclusion as a key message the author is trying to convey to the reader. It is a call for action for us to take part in a fight against this unjust social issue, and hence elaborates into why we're discussing this particular social issue, and why is it important to discuss particularly women in poverty and not men. Now we're going to move on to different practice questions to see whether or not you understood the reading effectively. Are you ready? Take out a pen and pencil, and we're going to get started. So, based on the options that are given, we're going to write true or false based on your understanding of the text. Spend about a minute, go through the different options, and we're going to come back to the answers. Let's go. Good luck. So the first question we're going to be looking at is that women are the majority of the poor because they experience societal disadvantage and bias towards their work and responsibility. Based on the reading, we know this to be true. According to the author, poverty is the root cause of gender inequality. That is true as well. Then, a common gender norm is that girls and women are responsible for productive activity outside the home. Is it outside? No, it is the inside. So that will be false. Then, men and women have equal access to education, employment, and other productive resources. They do not. They have unequal opportunities. So that will be false as well. Next, again, spend a minute, look through the 4 options. I'm going to come back to the answer. So number 5, girls and women are overrepresented in informal labor market and precarious job. That is true. Evidence has shown that women's income and labor are primarily directed towards the children's education, health, and well-being. That is true, because men spend it on their personal spending. Policies and programs continue to reinforce the idea that men are breadwinners and women are dependent. It is mentioned in reading, so that will be true. The last, policymakers are implementing poverty reduction plans that will ensure women's access to productive resources and gain economic independence. That was not mentioned in reading, so that was false. Did you get all of them right? Now we're going to move on to close reading, which means that you're going to step outside of the reading now and be able to expand your answers. So, in other words, poverty is a gender experience. Addressing and requires a gender analysis of norms and values, the division of assets, work and responsibility, and the dynamic of power and control between women and men in poor households. This is an excerpt from paragraph 1. Based on this particular segment, what meaning can you infer from it based on the 3 options that are given? Now I'm going to give you a little hint. The verb that is presented in this particular segment can signify important information as well as the attitude of the author. Can you find that particular verb? In this case, the important verb we're looking for is require a gender analysis. So the need, the urgency to do something. And based on the 3 options given, probably option B will fit the closest. So the relationship between gender and poverty needs to be better understood through factors that defines women and men differently in poor households. Essentially, what analysis is, we need to look at the different causes and results. Did you get it right? Let's move on to the next one. The drudgery of women's work and its time-intensive demands contribute to women's time poverty and greatly limit poor women's choices of other, more productive income-earning opportunities. With this particular segment, which one of these options best fits this text? Again, I'll give you 15 seconds. Good luck. Did you identify the key message in this particular segment? It is the concept of time poverty, in quotation, as well as more productive income earning opportunities because they do not have the time to do so. Based on these understanding, we can see that option best fitted will probably option A, that it is difficult for women to spend most time on time-consuming dull domestic work to undertake higher paying employment opportunity. That because of time, they do not have the chance. Did you get this right? We're going to move on to the next one. Faced with difficult time allocation choices, women in poor households would often sacrifice their own health and nutrition or the education of their daughter by recruiting them to take care of siblings or share in other household tasks. Now, based on this excerpt, which of the option best fits the description? Again, 15 seconds. Come on, come on. So the key message in this segment will probably be the woman in poor household would often sacrifice. So the key word is that they would do things for others, but not themselves. And so the option is probably option C. The lack of investment in female health, nutrition, and education is greater in poor household. The disproportionate share of resources. Did you get this right? Next, we're going to look at a segment from paragraph 8. Addressing these gender biases and inequalities by intentionally investing in women as economic agents, and doing so within a framework of rights that ensure that women's access to and control over productive resources is a part of their entitlement as citizens is an effective and efficient poverty reduction strategy. Again, identify the key meaning in this and be able to choose the best option. 15 seconds. Come on. So in this segment, we're probably going to be looking at the keyword rights. What kind of rights should they have? Should women in poverty have? That is an effective and efficient poverty reduction strategy from the government or from welfare agencies. In this case, based on the key information, we can see that the best option suited should be option A, is that they need to ensure that these actors need to ensure women's economic and social empowerment can effectively help them to combat poverty. Did you get it right? Lovely. We're going to move on. Now we're going to be looking at more vocabulary. The first one is the word vulnerability. When we look at the word vulnerability, we see the word ability. So we think to ourselves, it's a skill set. However, is it a positive or negative skill set? So the guess we have based on the word vulnerability from the context is that it's an inability to deal with the challenge faced by women, as the word vulnerability is placed in conjunction with the word increase their vulnerability and make it more challenging. So based on the context alone, we know that it's a negative ability. The dictionary definition of the word vulnerability is a state of being exposed to the effect of a hostile environment or the possibility of being harmed emotionally or physically. Hence, the use of this word vulnerability highlights further the situation of women in poverty being unideal. Next is the word drudgery. The word drudgery is being used to describe the woman's work and its time-intensive demands, and how it created a limitation on their choices and life. And so, based on our guess, we'll think that the word drudgery probably means hard work, probably domestic or demanding physical work. And you are right. In a dictionary definition, it simply means hard, dull, or uninspiring labor. Were you able to guess the meaning of this word based on the context? Next, we have the word entitlement. So the word entitlement comes within the context of that something that the woman should have. It's a part of their entitlement as citizen, as a human, something they should have. So our guess will probably the rights, their natural birthright as a human being. And you're right. The word entitlement in the dictionary definition is the right to benefit specifically, especially by law or contract. Now we're going to move on to how different collocations can help you better grasp the meaning of a word or cluster of meaning. Collocation is quite simple, means the combination of different words that just works together. So we're going to talk about the different combinations. The first one being verb plus a noun. So women constitute a majority of a poor. When we put these two together, they're normally paired together to express the meaning of being composed together or put together. Now, the next is adjective plus noun. So women face significant constraints in maximizing their productivity. Again, the word significant means a lot, much of it. Constraint is something that bounds you. So it helps to highlight the situation of women. The last is the collocation of preposition with noun. So there is incontrovertible evidence from a number of studies conducted during the 1980s. We're able to know the word from refers to the noun evidence. A number of studies, basically among these studies, how much of it was talking about women. And the last one we talk about time, so during the 1980s. Using different collocation of preposition and noun, we're able to identify the logical links between different clusters of meaning. Now that we've just talked about different collocations, we're going to do a little bit of grammar practice. Are you ready? On the screen, you'll see different words. These words could act as a noun, an adjective, or verb. Can you successfully put them in the correct boxes? Take about 15 to 30 seconds. Jot down your answers, and we're going to come back. Good luck. Now that we're back, let's look at the first one. So the first should be to effectively address the needs of poor women and men, because the word address could be both a noun or verb. Did you get it right? The second one should be to bear. Again, a noun and a verb. To bear disproportionate share of work and responsibility, the word bear became to carrying the load, to do the work. Then the third one will be in sharp contrast. It was an adjective. But in this case, the word sharp doesn't necessarily mean you're getting cut by scissors, but rather it's a very crisp, it's a very evident contrast. And then to have equal access to productive resources. Now, this particular access doesn't mean that you can get into places, but rather whether you can get this particular items you want from somewhere else. And the last will be to widen the gender-based productivity gap. Did you get all of them right? Now, at last, we're going to come to the last little bit of our class today. Basically, based on your reading for today, what thought-provoking ideas have you gotten from it? This is the last bit of critical reading. Having integrated all we learned, let it be reading strategy, inferring ideas, we're now going to synthesize all these different things together and be able to come up with our own thought-provoking ideas. So the first outreach questions is that, is there a possible connection between reading 1 and reading 2? They're both talking about poverty, but what kind of things did they discuss that are similar and that are different? The second one is that, why is that connection important to reader? So for you, why is it important to make these connections? Really think about it. And then what new thoughts do you have after a close reading of these articles on the topic of poverty? Did it change your views? Did it add it to your knowledge bank? What kind of things have you noticed that has changed? And at last, do these two articles have something in common that may point to a bigger picture? So based on your understanding of these two articles, have you had the chance to relate it to other things that perhaps was on your mind or perhaps something you've seen? And so we have come now to the last bit of synthesizing all these information together to help you create a more critical perspective. So the first question, is there a possible connection between reading 1 and reading 2? The first one comes from a macro point of view. It talks about poverty within the country, while the second one is more personal. It discusses it from a gender point of view. And so, having gained that more comprehensive understanding from different perspectives, we're able to unify these ideas and make them your own. And why was it important for you to understand these connections? Is that you will be able to understand the topic of social justice and poverty and how involuntary poverty is possible. As mentioned in reading 1, it could be seasonal, it could be political. It's not something that we can control. And then, what new thoughts have you had after a close reading of these articles on poverty? Perhaps you were able to sympathize and integrate these opinions to form a bigger picture for the overall understanding of the social issue and be able to act on it perhaps in the future or form your own idea of what social justice is. And at last, what kind of bigger picture are you looking at is that you can be developing critical thinking and critical reading skills and able to find meaning within the small piece of information that you see everywhere, as everything is connected. And so for today's class, we've completed the above-mentioned 6 goals. We're able to understand the social issue of poverty and practice different reading strategies, including anticipation, inferring of the meaning, be able to identify the main text and its supporting evidence, and at last be able to synthesize all these information together. I hope the class for today has been helpful to you, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.